And I think what people mean when they say it doesn't have a leader is it doesn't have a black male cis leader. Because I could actually point to, that's not shade, I just think part of how we orient ourselves around leadership in the black community is a black man who's usually a preacher that has a really great orator. That's how we sort of orient ourselves around a black leader. And very early on in the Black Lives Matter movement, we heard from, black celebrities and some folks in the old guard, like, don't mess with them. They don't know what they're doing. And what they were really saying is black women don't know what they're doing. Don't listen to them. And I think part of what we have to do is reorient ourselves around how we understand leadership. Because literally, I talk to leaders of Black Lives Matter across the globe weekly. I know what they're doing. I know the work that they've done. I know how they're living. I know, and they're powerful leaders, and they're listening, and they're building strategy, and they're brilliant practitioners. So we've never claimed ourselves as leaderless. We've never claimed that we don't have leaders. What we've named is that we don't believe in the idea of one single charismatic leader that's going to take us to freedom. That's not how people get free. It takes all of us to get free. And it takes lots of different ideas about how we get to freedom. And I think that's what's actually most exciting for me about being a part of this movement.
Mark, thank you for that, Patrisse. I just want to add to that because I couldn't agree more. And it's probably also instructive to remember that most people did not follow Martin Luther King.
Right.
Most people did not follow Malcolm X. They let Betty Shabazz live in welfare and poverty. Right?
Right.
Coretta Scott King stayed in a broken down shotgun shack until Oprah Winfrey bought her a home. Most people did not think of SNCC as leaders. And so what I think too, Patrisse, is that there's a lot of people who are afraid. And so when people put out a call to action, the way to get around actually having to do something is to stand on the outside and say, well, that's not real. There are no leaders. And I want to, acknowledge something that I said the other day. When you put that call out, and I'd already known you a couple of years, at that point, even from the first time I met you, you made me braver. You made me want to work harder. There's a way that you can go to a whole lot of meetings, and you can have a lot of paperwork and do a lot of reports, and get on a whole lot of conference calls, and think that you're actually doing something. And the needle doesn't move at all. And so I think that I was in that, right? And it was good, and I said good things, but you made me work harder, think deeper, push more, imagine more. And I think sometimes when the pushback comes against the Black Lives Matter movement, it's because people are just cowards.
It's something, I agree with everything you just said. I also just wonder if you were a cis hetero man. For example, wouldn't there be a lot more black people in the room right now? It's fascinating. I remember one of the white people that came and going to buy this book, 2 copies.
Gracious!
But he was serious too. Answer for Trump, maybe 3. I was struck when I came out, not by how many white people were, which is awesome, but I thought I expected more black folks to come out, and I wonder how much of that is linked to the idea of black women leading to just be illegible to us in so many ways. I know we got to pivot because we got a couple more questions. One question, ironically, is what can white people do to support your work? So, you got the first answer. There are some more substantive ways beyond that we can get to. Can you both answer that question?
I think that there's a lot of things, right? I think that there is really a reckoning that has to happen around Trump and the normalcy of white supremacy. I think that, for many women who are white feminists, there's a lot of people in your own families you have to have the courage to speak to, like I had to have the courage to speak to my family, who were, sort of middle class, fairly socially conservative Democrats, about politics that were not the norm for them. They certainly didn't expect their child who graduated high school at 15 to come home and say, and this is my baby daddy who's in prison, right? But they were going to have to learn how to deal with that. And I think to have those courageous conversations is pivotal, right? Not to just stand with white people who agree with you and who are progressive, but to have the kind of conversations we have with our own folks is important. And then some significant examples. I'll raise the name of Marilyn Buck, who drove the getaway car, so that Asada Shakur is now 38 years free. I'll raise the name of Laura Whitehorn, who did much time in prison. I want to raise the name of a man, actually whose name I don't know, but who protected, I thought he worked there, Bree Newsom, when she climbed up that flagpole. I thought homie worked there. Right, that was the whole point. He was just like, you ain't gonna hurt her on my watch. And they did. And he didn't center himself. Thank you. Right? He didn't say, let me tell you about like something that really totally bothered me though. You don't know his name. He just did the right thing and kept it moving like the majority of black organizers do every single day. So those are some pieces that we can do. And you can first do this. Listen. Deep, profound listening, which Mark is what informed. You were asking about writing process before. That's what informed this book. A deep listening, a deep sharing. Right?
Yeah. All of what Asha said. And I think for white folks in the room, join organizations. Join something. I think part of whiteness is to be very individual and to think that you could do everything on your own or you have the right solutions or answers to a thing. There's not so many conversations I've had with white people throughout the years. They're like, have you thought about doing this? And I'm like, are you qualified to ask me questions like that? So I would say, join an organization and learn and be willing to learn under folks of color and people of color. And there's specific, I don't know if there's a Surge chapter here standing up for racial justice. Are you in the room, Surge? Yep. Yes! Okay, raise your hand if you're part of Surge. Raise your hand high. White folks, these are the white folks you want to talk to join Surge. And Surge is a group of white anti-racist organizers who are organizing white people. And I think that is some really important work to do. And I was a part of the first team of folks of color in Los Angeles that was working with a group of white folks called AWARE, Anti-Racist Whites, Allies Everywhere, something like that. It's long, but this team of folks have been such an incredible resource to Black Lives Matter locally and do everything for the Black Lives Matter chapter. And it was been such an important moment to see anti-racist white folks really stand up for Black power.
Absolutely. We have a question here. I'm not going to take it and we'll wrap with this question. Can everyone hear? Let me come to you. My tail style.
I was just asking my friend here if there's an expression in English that I have it in Spanish, and it's just like, I take my hat off to you, because I always admire leaders like you that have your feet on the ground, that are really good leaders, that are not full of ego, and that know the way of doing a work that is transformative, that is human, that is real. And I really take my hat off to you because I can feel it, I can smell it here. So thank you for that. And my question is, at the beginning of the conversation, you said that, there was a moment, maybe it still is, that surveillance was happening with Black Lives Matter. And we in the immigrant movement are suffering that right now. Like several leaders have been taking around the country, and there's a lot of concern about that. Is there any advice that you can offer around that?
While you answer that, can you also, because I forgot to ask you this earlier, I got so wrapped up in all the other interesting stuff you were saying, talk about surveillance, not just of certainly activists, immigrant organizations, immigrant movements rather, immigration rights organizations, but also gangs. Can you add that? The war on gangs is also a critical piece, both earlier and now.
I'll start actually with the war on gangs because I actually think it's part of what informs the type of surveillance that happens to Black communities and immigrant communities, specific immigrant communities, not all immigrant communities. Mm-hmm. And, the war on gangs, raise your hand if you've heard of that term, war on gangs. Raise it high. Yeah. Now raise your hand if you've heard of the term the war on drugs. Right. So there's a difference there. And I think in a lot of ways, the last decade, there's been amazing organizing to popularize the war on drugs and the impact. The war on gangs is just as dangerous, not known as much, and it really was created both as an extension of the war on drugs, but also as an extension of surveilling our communities. Mm-hmm. And we often talk about surveillance in a way that separates us from remembering that the first surveillance tactics happened on Black people, right? Probation is surveillance. Mm-hmm. Parole is surveillance. Mm-hmm. And we can't separate that. But with the war on gangs, what ended up happening is essentially young people, mostly young Black men, turned into targets of local law enforcement under public safety. And gang members were labeled as domestic terrorists. Literally, that was the language. I'm not using hyperbolic language. Gang member equals domestic terrorist. And so they were seen as enemy combatants. And that's exactly how they were responded to. Hyper-criminalized, which meant the entire community was hyper-criminalized, patrolling of neighborhoods every hour, helicopter policing, and this becomes very normal. I think, and this fast forward in this current iteration of surveillance for Black activists in particular, many Black activists had their homes knocked on their door, FBI knocked on their home doors. Many activists have had local law enforcement raid their homes, arrest them, and we're seeing this now, especially with the immigrants movement. High-profile leaders. It's really a target of leadership. Yeah. And this is tricky because I remember the beginnings of us being surveilled, the first time my home was raided, calling one of my good friends and being like, what are we supposed to do? And he said the best thing you could do, because you're probably not going to stop being a leader in this movement against law enforcement, right? Because one way you could do it is to fall back, right? So it depends on your safety, but you probably won't do that. So the best thing you could do is shout it out loud and make everybody know what's happening, and organize and build the movement stronger. Our best defense against surveillance is us being aware that it's happening, us telling everybody else that it's happening, and us organizing so that we can be a stronger movement. Because we can't get rid of surveillance in the most immediate. We can't, it's a beast. But we can build enough of our capacity so that we can challenge it.
Can I just say something to that too, to add on to what you said, Patrisse, and specifically about immigrant communities? I mean, I think that I love what you said about shouting it and making it larger. I think that one of the things that's been so dangerous in the surveillance of immigrant communities has been, it's not even a bifurcation, it's been cut in so many ways. I can remember when we thought that DACA was like a beginning point, not an end point. Right? DACA throws away so many people, right? I mean, if you smoke a joint, you're not DACA.
Right.
Right? If, you know, whatever, I don't know, jaywalk. You don't make it onto that list. There's a certain person who can even be considered under that. The people who are considered for DACA need to raise their voices. And as well, all people who are surveilled and attacked and assaulted immigrant communities need to speak for all people who are attacked in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, right? It was all Jamaicans and Africans and Haitians, and what just happened right now with throwing out all the Haitian and Salvadoran and Honduran people.
Right.
You know, to something that you had said earlier, you know, Patrisse, is that, you know, this is very much a movement that will succeed when we decide to love the people who nobody has decided to love before.
Right.
And to honor the people who no one decided to honor before. And if we don't do that, then nobody will. And if we make the choice, you know, there's something that a colleague and dear friend of mine talks a lot about that happened in the Lodz ghetto, which was the largest ghetto outside of Warsaw during World War II. And it was producing a lot for the Nazis because they held them. And they thought they would survive. And then one day, as the Germans were losing the war, they said, give me, and then, you know, the Nazis had to provide them with a little bread, a little water, right? And one day they came and said, give me your children. And the leader, the Rebbe who was leading them, talked to the parents and said, sacrifice your children. It will save the many of us. And they loaded those babies and the elderly onto those buses, onto those trains, and they killed those people, those human beings. And by the time the Lodz ghetto was done, there was almost no one left. Of course, they were all killed. They come for one, they come for us all, period. And either we stand for humanity or we don't. There isn't an in-between.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for this portion because we are now going to sign some books and have some really good conversation.
How many books does everybody?
I think we have a good number in mind now. But I just have to say again, first, Asha, thank you for your tireless work, advocating, fighting, defending, writing, thinking, planning, often not getting the credit, but still doing the work anyway. It matters. Everything you've done has mattered. And I'm grateful to know you, to be your friend, and to learn from you. Patrisse, words can't describe how important you are to this moment, how important you are